Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. And we are breaking some news, an exclusive story that just came out on Juno News that Mark Carney, Canada's new prime minister, sent his daughter, his eldest daughter, Sasha, to the Tavistock Clinic, the transgender clinic in the UK, for treatment with regards to gender dysphoria. This happened when Sasha was a teenager. She lived in the UK from age 13 to 17. And during that time, she went to the Tavistock Clinic. We are joined today by the reporters who broke this story, True North's Cosmin Dzsurdzsa and Alex Zoltan. Alex, Cosmin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Candice.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll go to you first, Cosmin. Can you tell us about the story, what happened, how we found it, and tell us a little bit about the Tavistock Clinic for those who don't know.
Yeah, that's right. So Sasha Carney, who was born Sophia Carney, that's her birth name, is quite a public figure in her own right. She's a writer, a former student activist, and as the prime minister's daughter, one of four kids, she's had quite a public footprint. So we decided to investigate some of the things that she's written, and there's quite a lot of it. And part of that was this essay in which she discusses transgender issues. A lot of her writing is actually about LGBT and transgender issues. But in this particular piece, she discusses how she went to therapy at the Tavistock Clinic. And that the Tavistock Clinic, for those who aren't familiar with it, was shuttered by the National Health Service in the United Kingdom because of several exposés that revealed that clinicians were rushing children as young as 6 years old and under into life-changing, life-altering gender transition treatments, as they called it. And it was over 300 kids that were under 6 years old that were being pushed into this type of medicalization based on this idea that they somehow had gender dysphoria at this young age. And it caused lawsuits, and this is why this clinic was eventually shuttered. And it eventually led to the Cass review, which is that famous review that came out of the UK, disproving some of the claims that transgender community makes about the so-called effectiveness of this treatment.
Well, it's really remarkable. I mean, you have to sort of feel bad for a person like this. I'm talking about Sasha, because this was happening to her when she was a teenager. And, a parent's role in life is to help guide their children, particularly through some of the most difficult issues that they face in their teenage years. And so I mentioned off the top that Sasha lived in the UK with her dad when Mark Carney went to take that job for the governor of Bank of England. She was a teenager. We found that information because she has, like you said, she's a writer, she's a prolific writer, and she's been receiving a lot of publicity. So you can go back to when she was 13 years old, she was writing short stories, and there was a profile of her on an Ottawa blog that mentioned that she was 13 years old. And at that point, she was still going by Sophia, that she moved to the UK. And by the time she started at Yale University in 2017, when she was 17 or 18 years old, at that point, she was already going by Sasha. Alex, why don't you talk a little bit about the specific essay that you found that she talks about the Tavistock Clinic? What does she say? What does the essay tell us about this young woman?
Yeah, so she speaks a lot about not feeling trans enough, which I thought was really interesting. Clearly, a young person going through identity issues. Yeah, it's a very short essay. It's only, a couple of pages long. But as Cosmin had mentioned, she does have a really prolific online presence. And so there's a lot of other information out there. She's very political, which kind of adds to the mystique and intrigue of why she isn't a part of Carney's campaign like his other daughters. And I think that's kind of interesting as well.
Well, you mentioned it. So the youngest daughter, Cleo, people might recognize her because she was the one that was out introducing her father at the Liberal Convention. You can see her on the screen there. She is a first-year university student, a freshman at Harvard. Obviously a super impressive young woman. She spoke very eloquently. You saw how proud she is of her dad, and it kind of gives you like a warm feeling of like, what a lovely family. Like, look at this daughter. They must be so proud of her. And she also earlier appeared in a campaign ad for Mark Carney, just talking about why she thinks that her dad will be a great prime minister. She's sort of an influencer in her own right, and she's involved in a lot of left-wing environmentalist advocacy as well. But in light of the story about Sasha that we now know, it's like they have this one daughter that they're putting out in front of the campaign to try to focus attention over here. And then you realize this other story about their other daughter. And it is kind of sad. I want to point to this essay that was in Authenticity. We saw the headline of it. And one of the things, I'll just read a passage from it. She writes that I watched as a friend after a year of weekly appointments trying desperately to get an official diagnosis of gender dysphoria was denied the diagnosis, and with it any hope of top surgery because they sometimes wore skirts. So from that quote, I sort of see that these young women are almost trying to game the system. Like they go to therapy and they're trying to convince a therapist that they have gender dysphoria because they want to get top surgery, like a body altering surgery to make young women look more masculine and more like boys. I'll continue to read. She said that I felt a fierce surge of jealousy every time I walked into Tavistock for therapy and saw patients turn left towards the medical spaces I didn't feel trans enough to enter. So, judging from this passage, it appears that she was there for therapy, obviously, but that she wasn't on a pathway to being transitioned because she said, the other people turned left. Those were the ones that were getting to go to medical spaces for like more trans people, and that she was just going there for therapy. And so to me, that means that either the therapist or perhaps her parents weren't allowing her to go down that path. But yet they were still allowing her to go to Tavistock. And she mentioned earlier in the essay that she lived a block away from it. And so you have to wonder, age 13 to 17, still very much under the guide of your parents, that her mom and dad allowed her to do this, allowed for this to happen. And, now we see Sasha continuing in public life. She's a very prolific writer, as you mentioned. She endorsed Bernie Sanders for president, the sort of far left Democrat. Even though she's Canadian, I don't think she's American. Cosmin, what else has your research found?
Yeah, in that essay, she also discusses and advocates for child use of puberty blockers. She says that children have a right to puberty blockers, have a right to hormone therapy. So it's very evident that that was her intention, was to go down the medical transition route. But as you pointed out, perhaps it didn't look like that happened. She was just there for therapy. But on a larger scale, Mark Carney has never addressed this issue, what he thinks about the transgender issue, whether biological men should be in women's spaces. He's made a brief comment talking about it, America's war on woke. And he's never gotten any further into that. And we need to know where Mark Carney stands on these issues because he's going to go up for an election. He's an unelected. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we have that clip, so let's play this clip. This I did just to tee it up to the viewer. This is something that Mark Carney said that he's never been pressed on. Right? He comes out and he says the Americans are fighting a war on woke. We're going to continue to fight for inclusivity, which to me means that he is pro woke. Like he is woke. If he's opposed to the Americans fighting war on woke, then that would mean that he's pro woke. But no journalist has been able to ask him about this, and this makes me wonder if this is the reason why True North and Juno News and other independent media outlets have not been allowed anywhere near Mark Carney because they're worried that he might get pressed on this important issue that Canadians do deserve to know. Where does he stand on the trans issue? Does he believe that boys should get to play in girl sports? Does he believe that children should be able to access life-altering medications and surgeries? Like this is a huge topic right now, and he hasn't answered. So, let's first show that clip that you were referring to, Cosmin.
There's a fever gripping America. And while it rages, Canadians will remain resolute and true to our values. While America engages in a war on woke, Canadians will continue to value inclusiveness.
Now, it's interesting that he said that because that obviously stood out to all of us. And at the time, I thought maybe someone on his campaign had written the line and it had kind of gone over poorly, so they never mentioned it again because it almost seemed out of character for Mark Carney. He doesn't seem like a radical. He doesn't seem like a leftist. And yet he said that, and he didn't say anything else like that ever again. Like I said, the media never pressed him on it. But given this new information that's come to light about his own daughter, it does sort of say, okay, well, he is on that side. He does believe these things. He lived them in his own family and allow this to happen with his daughter. So obviously he is woke. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, it seems like a very radical departure from the Trudeau liberal leadership, because Trudeau never neglected an opportunity to put himself behind, I'll just call it the rainbow agenda, I guess you could call it. Whereas Mark Carney almost seems to be running away from it. And this woke comment is really the only glimpse of what we might know about his actual opinions on the subject. He's been very evasive. And so, if Trudeau were in charge and Sophia was his daughter, I feel like, he would be using her as center stage for his political campaigning. So I find this is kind of an interesting departure.
Well, it's interesting, but I think that times have changed. I really believe that most people in the West, most Canadians, are not on board for this kind of thing. Like, they see it as an issue of fairness. I certainly do. I don't want little boys playing sports against my daughters. I just don't want that. And when I go back to my own childhood, like, one of my best memories was playing sports, and being a girl playing sports is an opportunity that you only get because of girls' leagues. And if all of a sudden you're allowing boys to go in there, allowing boys to invade female spaces like locker rooms, bathrooms, even women's shelters and female prisons. I mean, we've seen all kinds of horrors happen in those environments over the last decade. And I think enough people are saying, like, enough with this stuff. It's not a good idea, particularly around children. Remember, Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, banned these kinds of things, puberty blockers and surgeries for minors. And, I think a lot of people were expecting like a huge blowback, and it just didn't happen because people want this. Like, even people on the political left that I talk to, they're not on board with this kind of thing. They think it's wrong, particularly with children. And so maybe Mark Carney's just reading the political environment. Now, just to disclose to the viewer, we're not reporting at all that Mark Carney's daughter transitioned or that she took any kind of puberty blockers or pharmaceutical drugs or had any kind of surgery. That's not confirmed at all. That's not what the story is. The story is simply that she went to this gender clinic for therapy. She wrote about it in an essay, and that gender clinic has since been closed due to completely unethical practices and whistleblowers basically showing that young children were rushed into transition. So really interesting. If you go through her bio as well, when she was attending Yale University, she was interviewed for an article. I believe we have a picture of it here, that Yale University decided to give students the option of identifying as non-binary. So Yale gives students 3 gender choices. And Sasha Carney was quoted heavily in this piece, talking about herself as a transgender person and as being non-binary. And so that is quite interesting. And we also found a record of an official name change. So she changed her name legally from Sophia Carney to Sasha Carney in 2021, but we can tell by her writing that she went by the name Sasha Carney from a much younger age. But she legally did it. Interestingly, that she did it in New York, given that I believe she's a Canadian and a citizen of the UK, or maybe she's not a citizen of the UK, but she lived in UK for high school. But she currently lives in Brooklyn. So, I mean, it sort of seems like she's having some kind of an identity crisis. What do you think, Cosmin?
Yeah, but she's also a student activist. From the pieces I've read of her time at Yale and at university, she was pretty much pushing for these issues at the student level. And it's we're talking about Mark Carney. I think Mark Carney is attempting to portray himself as a conservative, and that's why he won't touch this issue. And on the other hand, it's also the rabid nature of transgender activists who would totally skewer him if he went in any other direction than the one they approve of. And
Well,
I doubt, yeah.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, including presumably his own daughter, because she does seem to be quite an activist. Like, some of the other positions that she advocated for in these essays that she wrote, like the abolition of prisons, like all prisons, basically all criminals should be allowed out on the street. Obviously, this was in the context of like the Black Lives Matter, like defund the police, but she went even further, right? Most people were just saying, most radical leftists were just saying defund the police, but she was saying, and abolish all prisons. And like you said earlier, she advocates for children receiving these life-altering pharmaceutical drugs and surgeries. You can continue, Cosmin.
Yeah, and it's important to ask these questions. This is our prime minister, and nobody else is doing it. The legacy media refuses to ask him any tough questions or try to get his views about anything other than what he wants to talk about. And Mark Carney has been totally silent on this in terms of getting responses to us. We've repeatedly tried to reach out to Mark Carney to offer him an opportunity to explain himself and to tell Canadians where he stands on these issues. And he has refused every attempt. He's thrown out our reporters. He's thrown out other independent media reporters. But this is our job. This is the job of journalists, to look into the most powerful person in this country.
Well, and particularly his daughter. And also of note, the story that we're talking about did happen when she was a teenager. She was 13 to 17 when she was in the UK, and that is when she went to the Tavistock Clinic. But she's now an adult. She's a 24-year-old. She lives in Brooklyn. She's a public figure because she writes prolifically, including about personal details of her own life. So, we're not pulling anything that's not already published in the public domain already. Now, Alex, you reached out to Sasha Carney. Did she reply to you?
No, she did not. And she's also removing some of her other socials as well. So I think she's trying to, evade public scrutiny, as is her right.
Yeah, I mean, she is a private citizen, but her father is the prime minister of this country. And I think that it's completely fair game to ask him what his positions are, given what happened with his own daughter.
I agree.
And interestingly as well, this is sort of an interesting thing. She says, like, in every time she's profiled, every time she's interviewed, she says that she goes by they them pronouns, but yet she's still referred to as Mark Carney's daughter. So maybe this is like my own ignorance. I don't quite understand. Like, she considers herself non-binary, but she still considers herself to be Mark Carney's daughter. Alex, can you explain that to me?
No, actually, I can't. I was thinking about that last night as well. I don't know if gender neutral folks go by daughter or son, right? I mean, what would you describe them as a child? I don't know, frankly. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know either. Cosmin, do you know?
Well, I would assume the neutral term would be Mark Carney's child, but that's also like infantilizes it a little bit. But yeah, and there's not a lot of clarity. I think there is a lot of confusion that comes across in her own writing, right? This need to meet society's standards, the standards that I guess the transgender community has set for themselves. There is this expectation to go become medicalized and do the full thing, have a full cross-gender operation. I think most transgender people set that bar and look at themselves and consider whether they're going that direction. But from her own writing, it's a lot about, well, am I trans enough? Am I meeting these expectations? But it just goes to show how agenda driven and almost this like sort of like cult-like status the transgender community has imposed on the people who have fallen into it.
Yeah, it's so strange because when I was reading about her as well, I noticed the demand for they them pronouns. But then anytime I read about her, like the CBC, she won some poetry prize back in 2019, or she was nominated for one. And there's an article about her in the CBC, and they refer to her as they, which as a reader, I just get confused. Like, I don't understand how a single person can be they. I know that she insists on using they, them, but it doesn't make sense from a written perspective, which is why I noticed in our piece at Juno News, we still refer to her as she because she was born a woman, and I think she is still a woman, just a confused one, sadly. What a sad story. I can't help but feel bad for this young woman, and I feel a little bit of like anger and frustration at her parents for allowing this to happen to her. Well, Cosmin, Alex, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you highlighting this, you spending the weekend obviously researching and putting this information out. So thanks so much for all your work.
Thank you, Candice.
Thank you.
All right, folks, head on over to junonews.com. You can see the full article, and I encourage you to subscribe to Juno as well and help support independent journalists like Cosmin and Alex and all the work that they do at True North. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show. We'll be back again tomorrow with all the news updates. We'll talk about Mark Carney and his trip to Europe, his new cabinet, him abolishing or at least saying he's getting rid of the carbon taxes, and much, much more. So we'll be back tomorrow with all the news. Thank you, and God bless.